Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where in the world you are today. Welcome back to the second day of the 10-year Facility Learning Exchange 2020 on community resilience and land rights progress. My name is Fred Pearce. I'm a London-based journalist on environment and land rights issues, and I am the moderator for this afternoon. A little bit of housekeeping. I hope most of you were able to take part in yesterday's session, but whether you did or not, here is a reminder of a couple of things. First, please keep your microphones and video turned off. This is to protect bandwidth so that you can still hear and see us. Second, to receive interpretation, please click on the interpretation button, which I hope you will find on the bottom of your screen, and choose your preferred language. We have English, Spanish, Portuguese, Bahasa Indonesian, and French available. And third, if you wish to ask questions of the speakers as we go along, please use the Q&A facility, which again, you should see at the bottom of your screen. I will put as many of those questions as I can to the speakers in the panel session at the end of the day in a couple of hours. Now, today our geographical focus is Latin America. We will see video and hear speakers from Guyana, from Peru, from Belize, and from Colombia, where there will be sessions on both indigenous peoples and those of African descent. We will hear from each of these places in turn, and the speakers will, as I say, return then for the panel session at the end. Now, our theme today, it's a loose theme, but it's a binding theme, is the importance of land rights in climate mitigation and biodiversity protection. We hope that most of our speakers will address that at some point, at any rate. To introduce that, and before we go to the country sessions, we have a keynote from David Kamovitz, formerly of the Ford Foundation's Natural Resources and Climate Change Program, and now a senior advisor for the Climate and Land Use Alliance. His presentation lasts 15 minutes, and David, I hope you're ready to go ahead, so please hear now from David.
Hello to everyone, and many thanks to the 10-year facility and to Paula in particular for inviting me today. I'm very happy to be able to share my presentation today, and I will put it up on the screen. Let me, how are we doing? Can you see it on the screen?
Yes, we can. Thank you, David.
Excellent. In keeping with the topic of today's session, I'll be talking about the indigenous and Afro-descendant communally or collectively managed territories in Latin America. And here are 5 things that you need to know about this issue. First, I'll be talking about why it's important and how important it is. I think usually people don't realize how important that indigenous and Afro-descendant territories are in Latin America for climate and biodiversity, in addition, of course, to being very important for the indigenous peoples themselves. Then I'll be talking about guardians. Why are indigenous peoples and Afro-descendants in Latin America guardians of the forest, and what evidence do we have that they play that role? I'll be talking about what worked, why things have why they've been able to be guardians in the past, what's been key, what's functioned, what's been successful, but why those things that have functioned and been successful in the past are now threatened. And that will get us to the need to act. If this is very important, and if these people are in fact the guardians of the forest and we know why, and that's now under threat, it is very important for us to move forward and act. So why is it important? First of all, we're talking about somewhere between 330 and 380 million hectares of forests that are in these indigenous and Afro-descendant territories in Latin America. That's an area about 10 times the size of Germany, 2 times the size of Mexico, 3 to 4 times the size of Bolivia. And that's 1/3 of all of Latin America's forests are in these territories. And not only is it an important part of Latin America's forests, it's important a part of the world's tropical forests. 1/7 of all of the carbon stored in the tropical forests of the world, about 14%, is in these indigenous and Afro-descendant communally managed forests. If we think about what's the importance of this for climate, well, first of all, that huge amount of carbon is very important, because if that carbon gets lost, it will create huge greenhouse gas emissions and increase the temperature. But it's also important because these forests play an important role in regional rainfall and in local temperatures. A huge amount of water gets evaporated every year from these forests into the sky, and that water is very important both for regional rainfall and for temperature. If we think about biodiversity, almost half of all of the intact forest in the Amazon, and by intact forest, I mean large areas of compact forest that haven't been disturbed significantly, are in these indigenous and Afro-descendant territories. And if we look at the specific case of Brazil, the indigenous territories in Brazil have more vertebrates, that's more mammals, more reptiles, more amphibians, more birds, than all of the protected areas outside the indigenous territories. So these territories are very important for the global climate, for the regional climate, and for biodiversity. Now, how do we know that these indigenous territories and the people who manage them, the indigenous peoples and the Afro-descendant communities, are in fact guardians of the forest? First, we have studies from almost every single different country in Latin America that show that the deforestation rates are lower in these territories. They're even lower after you account for the fact that these territories tend to be more remote, have worse soils, and have less access to markets. Even if you take those things into consideration, these territories have less deforestation. They also have less forest fires. Even if we compare the deforestation rates and the forest fires with protected areas, in many cases, these indigenous and Afro-descendant territories have lower deforestation and fewer forest fires than protected areas outside indigenous territories. And in terms of carbon emissions, a study that was done recently for the entire Amazon basin, that's not just Brazil, but all 9 Amazon basin countries, looking at the period from 2003 to 2016, found out that in net terms, these indigenous and Afro-descendant territories in the Amazon basin had almost no carbon emissions. What does that mean? That means that whatever carbon was lost from the area because of deforestation or forest degradation was actually almost a similar amount was captured as the trees were capturing additional carbon from the forest. Now, why is this case? Why have they been successful guardians of the forest? The first key, and this obviously is close to the heart of the tenure facility, is the territorial rights. About 200 million or more than 200 million of those 330 to 380 million hectares already have land title or other sorts of formal recognition from the government. That has allowed them to keep out external groups that are threatening their forests. And as a result, we see in a number of peer-reviewed studies that deforestation in these territories is actually much lower when they have title than when they don't have title. And when they've passed farther in the direction of having a title, they actually have lower deforestation. One study, for example, found that the title territories in Bolivia, Brazil, and Colombia in the Amazon have deforestation rates that are between 1/2 and 2/3 lower than areas outside these indigenous territories. Another thing which is very important for making this a success is cultural revitalization and traditional knowledge. The strengthening, the consolidation, the defense of indigenous identities, indigenous languages is key to maintaining the social cohesion, the collective spirit, the collective action in these territories. And many aspects of the indigenous cultures are in fact important for the lower deforestation rates. In particular, we find that indigenous and Afro-descendant peoples in Latin America have much less cattle, and that's a huge difference in terms of their production systems, and almost rarely use agricultural machinery, which in tractors and other sorts of agricultural machinery, which is very key in a lot of the deforestation processes in Latin America. Their knowledge about the forests, about forest fires, about forest management, about the different plants and different aspects of the local environment are also key for successful guardians of the forest. Community forestry is key in many of these indigenous and Afro-descendant areas. There are thousands of communities in these indigenous and Afro-descendant areas that are managing their forests well for commercial purposes. They're selling either timber or non-timber products or tourism activities that provide very important livelihoods and social benefits that give them a strong incentive and also give them the resources that they need to be successful guardians of the forest. And the experience has shown that governments that support these efforts, rather than over-regulate these efforts and try to control them, usually get better results in terms of forest management and sustainability. Another key important thing in terms of the success in many African and descendant and indigenous territories in Latin America has been payment for environmental services, not to individual landowners, but to the communities as a whole. There are experiences in Costa Rica, Guatemala, Ecuador, Mexico, Peru, where communities are being compensated for a little bit over 4 million hectares across these countries. And studies in all of these countries have shown that in areas that have these payment for environmental services to communities, there is less deforestation and many social benefits. So we know that these indigenous territories and Afro-descendants have been guardians of a very large portion of the world's tropical forests. It's very important for climate and biodiversity. But the fact that they've been successful in the past doesn't mean that they're going to continue to be as successful in the future, because the threats are growing very quickly. The guardians of the forest are under siege from roads and dams moving into their areas, making it easier for other groups to come in and invade their areas and making it more profitable to do so. There's all sorts of external groups that have been emboldened to try to move into these areas and threaten the indigenous and Afro-descendant forests. Cattle ranchers, large-scale farmers, small-scale settlers, mining companies, artisanal forests, oil companies, loggers, drug traffickers. And with the threats, while the threats are rising, government support has actually been declining. And that decline is even more notable in the context of the COVID virus, where the pandemic has weakened these communities and weakened the government's ability to protect them. And we also know that in many areas, the communities are losing their knowledge. Some languages are being lost in different parts of the world. The identities are breaking down. And it's important to support cultural revitalization as part of these efforts. So we are seeing in recent years that even while the deforestation and forest degradation in these territories is lower than in other parts of the forest in Latin America, deforestation rates are rising in places like the Brazilian Amazon, in Southeast Mexico, in parts of Central America, in the Chiquitania in Bolivia. Forest fragmentation is increasing as these roads come in and new areas are opened up, which threatens both the climate and the biodiversity. Fires are coming in from outside these areas and threatening the forest as a result. Oil spills and mercury poisoning are threatening the waters and the fish and the people of these territories. The numbers of indigenous activists, community leaders, villagers who are being killed each year has been regularly rising, reaching several hundred a year, and in addition to hundreds a year, which are being criminalized simply for defending their own territories. And each year, an increasing number of very, very important indigenous languages, which is world cultural heritage are being lost. So now we need to act. We cannot assume that the forests that the indigenous peoples and Afro-descendants have been successfully protecting for hundreds of years will continue to be there without the assistance and alliances with outside groups. We know what to do. We just talked about what works. We have lots of studies that show what works: titling, recognition of territorial rights, community forestry, payment for environmental services, strengthening cultural revitalization and traditional knowledge, and supporting indigenous organizations. We also are beginning to have studies that show that this is very cost effective, that in fact, for each dollar or each euro that is invested, the results in terms of carbon emissions are very cost effective, cheap compared to other ways of reducing emissions into the air. And it's also cost effective in terms of biodiversity conservation. So we can't just promote these as outside reforms or policies for governments to enact. This has to be a process that is directly linked with and collaborating and allied with supporting indigenous and Afro-descendant organizations, which are at the forefront and the vanguard of defending these territories. And within that context, women and youth are totally key. Women are the majority of the indigenous peoples. They're key in many of the forest management aspects and certainly in traditional knowledge, and key in the governance of these territories. The youth of these territories are the future for not just the territories, but for the planet. Because without these territories, without control of these emissions and the protection of the biodiversity, the current threats put us all at risk. Thank you very much.
David, thank you very much. As ever, thought-provoking and persuasive. If you have any questions for David, he'll be on the panel later, so please send them in via the Q&A facility at the bottom of your screen. Meanwhile, we're going to begin our journey through Latin America in Guyana, on the north coast of South America. Before we hear from our speakers, we're going to begin with a short film, just 5 minutes long, and then we'll be straight into our speakers with Nicholas, Frederick, and others. Here's the film.
Guyana's dense forests have for generations been safeguarded by indigenous populations, who make up around 1/10 of the population. As the world wakes up to the need to protect these forests through climate funding, there have been renewed efforts to title indigenous land. Since 2019, the Tenure Facilities Partners, the Amerindian Peoples Association, and the South Rupununi District Council have been working to secure tenure for 14 indigenous communities, allowing them to plan for the future and manage their forest lands sustainably for generations to come. The arrival of COVID-19 in Guyana has hit these indigenous communities hard. Luckily, the Tenure Facilities Partners, with their deep relations to the communities they work alongside, were able to respond.
We were able not only to support the communities with food supplies, because hospitals and health centers in the communities also felt the need, and they were also scarce on personal protective gears. We were able to supply some of them very early with PPE items when even the government was not able to do.
Another significant challenge in these times has been communication. Already at a distance from the coastal capital, villagers have found themselves cut off, reliant on shaky internet connections to maintain contact with the outside world.
The APA in another project have already begun training a core set of people from the Maruka District Council in the use of technology so that we can have virtual training, virtual meetings. Communication became one of the focal points for us in reaching out to communities, in creating ways to ensure our work goes forward. As a result of this, we are currently in a village called Oriala. This village has not been infected, so they've been lobbying us to come into the community. Even our visit to the village is kind of restricted, and we're looking at using hailers to make updates at different points in the community, passing on information to key persons and for them to also update the community. We'd be using flyers as well in an effort to update.
Although this trip was allowed, the tenure facilities partners elsewhere have been hampered by restrictions on meetings.
Many of the district councils, they have not been able to meet, or if they have, they may have not been able to meet as a whole body. So this has really restricted governance issues, decision-making, and so forth.
We had to rotate workers to minimize the amount of people gathering. We had to do it on a rotational base. All self-help we had to cancel because of the gathering. So it really affected project implementation in the community.
We had thought that by mid-2020, we would have been able to go back in the field. We are now adjusting our mind to the fact that this may not be possible in a short time. So how do we think beyond 2020? We would need to be very innovative in terms of how we conduct our business of the association, but how indigenous communities as well conduct their business. It means that we will have to do things differently, perhaps with improved communication systems, have online meetings, but also go a lot more into the production of manuals and handouts and posters.
The work in the communities continue, and to ensure that we have feedbacks from the community and that they are not isolated, that the work of securing land tenure can continue. At the end of the day, we can still move ahead as long as the interests and the commitments are there.
Thank you. Very interesting film. We now have two speakers from Guyana. The first is Nicholas Fredericks, who among his many duties is chairman of the National Toshao Council, which represents the country's indigenous peoples. He's also been working to secure the land rights of his own Wapishan people in the south of the country in Rupununi on the border with Brazil. Nicholas, it's good to see you again. Please tell us about progress. You have about 5 minutes, please.
Okay, thank you very much for allowing me to be part of this panel discussion here. Yes, the SRDC, the South Rupununi District Council, through the importance of demarcation and titling, has realized that there is small, we only have a title to a small portion of our territory. And this is a threat because of the extractive industries that threaten the very territory that should be titled towards communities. In these areas as well, we have vast amount of pristine rainforest, which is untouched. But like I said earlier, it's threatened towards the mining sector and large-scale agriculture. Having the political will to ensure that these titles are important, having that political will as well. So the SRDC has used the opportunity and the collective efforts to engage governments to ensure that they understand the importance of titling and demarcation. We have also, towards climate change, put vast amount of our forested areas within our territory as community consort forests, whereby mitigating the effects of climate change, although we see the effects here, we feel the impacts, we think that this is a way that we can deal with the climate change. Also, we are currently, through the support of Tenure Facility, conducting mapping of our headwaters, our cultural areas, so we can also use this as justification towards titling of our lands. We would also have, towards the mitigation of climate change, ensure that our fires are not being used out of control, which can also contribute towards the destruction of our forests. Some of the challenges that we currently face is the land titling process is very complicated. Through the land talks and currently through the support of Tenure Facility, we are now looking to re-engage the new government to bring them up to date as to what we have been doing with the previous administration and what we see as a model for titling to be fast-tracked and in a more transparent manner. The Aboriginal Land Titling Unit needs to be reshuffled. We are currently working on that. There's also the need for having the technology and the relevant support to deal with all of this during the global pandemic that we now face. Yes, so that towards the question 3, I think I will ask my colleague Jean to answer question 2. But towards the question 3, the district councils, it's important, extremely important, because it allows us to have a collective voice where, you know, sometimes the political agenda is to divide and rule. If you have these district council, you have a more stronger collective voice where the representation are stronger, and where we do that to represent individual community issues and the territorial issues at large. So having a district council is very important in that regard. The SRDC have over time became a body that has been recognized nationally and internationally because of the efforts and the commitment of leaders and staff. And we have become a known representative body here in Guyana to really make representation on behalf of the Wapichana people. We have also were able to make collective decisions because we realize that sometimes communities sometimes make decisions on their own and it's not as has the weight that if it is being made in a collective basis. So that is one of our strengths as well. In the COVID-19 pandemic, the district council really assisted in terms of letting the country and the region understand what we are doing here to tackle the pandemic. We were able to lock off the borders collectively and not individually. So that in a sense has its good results. We are also able to really revitalize the cultural knowledge with the work that the district council is doing territorially, whereby involving the youths, elders, so the knowledge, the traditional knowledge is being strengthened and recognized by our youths, and to link that to the land and how that knowledge also contribute to land management. So the district council having a collective role is have one of these results as well. We are willing, the SRDC is willing to share our experiences as to how we became legally established, but also how we function and how do we overcome challenges together, because at many times, if it is not being done properly, there could be division within the territory as well. But we are willing to share our experiences as to the importance of district council. So I want to thank the Tenure Facility Program and look forward to continued support in the future. So I'll ask. So thank you very much, Fred.
Thank you, Nicholas. That was excellent. Thank you very much. As Nicholas mentioned there, we're now going to hear from Gina Rose, who's the director of the Amerindian Peoples Association in Guyana. One of the things that I hope you'll maybe want to talk about is the Guyana government has been revisiting the Amerindian Act. So Jean, maybe you can tell us about that. And again, you have 5 minutes, so off you go.
Thank you, Fred. And yes, legislative reform is very key to a number of things towards protection of the rights of the indigenous peoples in Guyana. We have had various instances of where legislation has been revised and so forth, but we are still at a stage where there is need to address various issues. Guyana, we have the Amerindian Act, which is legislation dating back from colonial times, in fact. But in 1966, when we gained independence from the British, we actually had a more intense overhaul, at least in words, if not in content, of the Amerindian Act. Today, we have issues in relation to the need for protections of land rights. Land rights in terms of traditional rights, we still do not have our communities being protected in terms of ancestral ownership of land. And that is something that we would like to see included in the Amerindian Act. You would have heard Nicholas mention of climate change and the need for protection of indigenous lands, the need for titling and demarcation. All of these need to also be protected in legislation, whereby we are now facing situations where we have the extractive sector for decades, in fact, but even more so now, the extractive sector with the price of gold going up, and it goes down sometimes and then it goes up. But with no protections there, we have had clashes with the extractive sector, mining on our lands, for example, and we've had conflicts, environmental pollution, and so forth. So we need to have protections in those regards. Guyana is going into oil extraction as well. And even though it's offshore oil drilling that's taking place, there are consequences for indigenous communities, with our country possibly getting more monies and being able to operate even more in the interior of the country. We can face problems in terms of those very extractive sectors that may be miles away from our communities. And therefore, it's important that we have our protections in those regards. Keeping the forest standing. David, in his presentation earlier, spoke about the importance of indigenous peoples in protecting the forest and preserving the forest and in keeping the forest standing and so forth. It's basically the same thing for the indigenous communities in Guyana. In terms of decision making, again, we have come out of a history of someone else making decisions for us. And we are still in a position where, to a large extent, the Amerindian Act provides for someone else making decisions for us. Again, you heard from Nicholas talking about the role of the district councils and how important it is for the district council to be part of the decision-making process within their communities, but nationally as well. All of these need to be coined in legislation, and participating in what happens on our land, participating in what happens in our health system, for example, COVID taking the communities, affecting the communities at the moment, participating in education, participating in health issues across the field. It is important that our indigenous communities are able to participate and not have a minister or not have someone else making decisions for us. And therefore, this is another area that needs to be addressed in the revision of the Amerindian Act. Governance, again, I just want to touch a little bit more on that in relation to the district councils. The district councils are representative bodies of collective villages throughout Guyana, and there are several ones that are moving to have themselves registered. How do they function in relation to the national local government system? There is a huge gap in that regard when it comes to legislation. And therefore, all of this need to be worked out in terms of what is the role of the district council in relation to national government? What is the role of the district council in relation to our internal regional government system? What is the role of our individual village councils in relation to the district councils, in relation to the regional councils, and in relation to national decision-making processes? These are areas that we need to cover. So in terms of legislative revisions, legislative protections, these are areas that we're looking to cover using the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as our guide in terms of the provisions that we will make for the communities. The tenure facility has played a key role in terms of being able to provide a space, provide the opportunity for us to dialogue with the government. We have a new government come into place. So unfortunately, we have to restart dialogue anew with a new government, having a new way of dealing with things as well. But certainly it has created a space, and it's an area that we will continue to push on. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean. That was very interesting. If you have questions for either Jean or Nicholas, then please submit them to the Q&A button. Now we're moving on from Guyana. We're going to travel south to Peru, where I was going to say the president has promised to right his country's wrongs in land title in time for the bicentenary of Peru's independence, which is next year. But I see there's some quite heavy politics going on in Peru right now. Some people are talking about a coup. Certainly there's a crisis there. So maybe we're going to have to think again about some of those things. I don't know. But first off, and done before the political repercussions going on there now, here is our video.
In Peru, the Tenure Facilities partners have been working to right historic wrongs against indigenous peoples, who have for decades seen their land polluted and forests destroyed in the scramble for oil and extractive wealth. That tide is beginning to turn, and last year the Peruvian president himself attended an emotional ceremony in the vast northern Lurita region to see 66 indigenous communities receive the title to their lands. But with Peru badly hit by the coronavirus, indigenous populations are seeing resurgent threats to their lands, livelihoods, and lives.
Que los comuneros entiendan que esta epidemia es mortal. Bueno, ahorita hay terceras personas que están llegando a nuestra comunidad, entrando a buscarse trabajo, recursearse porque en el pueblo no hay trabajo. Hemos decidido cerrar nuestro portón y nuestro puerto, así tener seguridad a nuestros ancianos, a nuestros hijos, a nuestros comuneros, que no sean afectados con el COVID-19.
The Tenure Facilities partners, the Peruvian Environmental Law Society, and the Federation of the Madre de Dios River and its tributaries, and the Inter-Ethnic Association for the Development of the Peruvian Rainforest, have been working to improve relations between indigenous communities and government. During coronavirus, the local authorities are doing what they can to provide assistance.
Soy médico contratado para la Dirección Regional de Salud, la cual ha visto por conveniente implementar el programa de respuesta rápida en comunidades indígenas. Procedí a muestrear a todos los pacientes para ver si están infectados o no están infectados. En esto en preocupación para prevenir el avance de esta infección y poder monitorizar también los signos, los síntomas que puedan presentar y darle tratamiento adecuado para que las comunidades no se vean afectadas por este mal que está afectando a toda la población.
Still, many communities are turning to traditional medicines.
Se está haciendo varios tipos de preparados, ¿no? Para ser más fuertes y prevenir el COVID también. En mi comunidad estamos preparando varios preparativos con matico, estamos tomando, digamos, la caña y varias componentes que tienen que ver mucho para la neumonía.
Meanwhile, the Tenure Facilities partners are finding new ways to work on the larger project, with telecommunications playing a central role.
Seguimos trabajando virtualmente porque contamos con internet en nuestra comunidad, pero sin embargo también todas las comunidades no llegan, pero estamos haciendo todo lo posible desde la federación con las organizaciones indígenas.
Hemos armado un protocolo propio creado por nosotros de no salir a puerto, limitarnos, estar cerca de la ciudad de Puerto Maldonado. Lo importante es que se mantiene.
The pandemic has allowed tenure facilities partners to reflect on the relevance of the issues at stake. Whilst there are still hurdles to be overcome in Peru, they are devoted to continuing to develop good working relationships with main stakeholders and government agencies. And there is renewed hope, with the government pursuing an ambitious plan to recognize the lands of all identified indigenous and peasant communities by 2021.
Te da esperanza, señor Plácido.
El Estado se dé cuenta que los pueblos indígenas y las comunidades protegemos la selva.
Okay, thank you for that. Now we have 3 speakers on Peru, so time is going to be tight. First, let us hear from Jorge Perez, the president of the Indigenous Peoples Organization of the East. He's from the Loreto region of Peru, where the largest number of indigenous people live. Jorge, I don't know if you're able to comment on events in the last couple of days. You may not wish to, but what are the challenges now for securing the rights of those communities?
Sí, muy buenos días a todos. Soy Jorge Pérez. Loreto es una de las regiones más grandes del Perú y es la región que más demanda tiene de titulación de tierras. En los últimos 20 años se ha venido desarrollando la titulación de tierras gracias a la cooperación internacional, porque de parte del Estado no hay la voluntad política de darle a los pueblos indígenas la titularidad legal de su tierra. Entonces, se ha venido cerrando estas brechas, pero hasta ahora hay un promedio de 250 comunidades que aún están por titular. El principal reto es que se tiene que contar con el apoyo financiero y con el apoyo técnico y coordinar con el Estado, porque el Estado es la que titula, ¿no? Y poder avanzar juntos en esta demanda, ¿no? De asegurar el territorio de los pueblos indígenas a fin de que puedan vivir del bosque, ¿no? De conservarlo y a la vez, ¿no? De combatir juntos la lucha contra el calentamiento global.
Excuse me, I forgot to unmute. Thank you, George. Next, we have Orfiles Perez, a legal advisor for the regional government of Loreto, who's leading the process of legal titling. So, Orfiles, how is progress going towards meeting the presidents, or perhaps I should say the ex-presidents? Maybe you can enlighten me to meet that target. So, Orfiles, if you can, well, you have 3 or 4 minutes, please. Thank you.
Estamos aquí en la región Loreto, que es la región más grande de todo el Perú. Sin embargo, hemos hasta la fecha reconocido 1,217 comunidades nativas. Hemos titulado 845 comunidades nativas y de las cuales también se han llegado a hacer ampliaciones territoriales, 100 comunidades nativas quedando pendiente por titular 372 comunidades nativas. El año 2019, con la presencia del presidente de la República Peruana, el ingeniero Vizcarra, se entregaron 63 títulos de comunidades nativas, quien se comprometió que al año 2021 deberíamos cerrar las brechas de todas las comunidades nativas para titular, que están pendientes 372. Gracias a los proyectos y cooperación internacional, como también el programa TF que maneja la SPDA, la Dirección Regional Agraria de Loreto ha logrado identificar gran parte de estas comunidades nativas o pueblos originarios asentados. En el contexto de la pandemia tenemos realmente en este momento un poco de dificultades para poder llegar a estas comunidades y darles la solución. Sin embargo, a través del gobierno regional de Loreto, con la cooperación de las instituciones internacionales, estamos tratando de dar la solución a este conflicto encontrado por esta pandemia y tratar de solucionar estos títulos que aún faltan, que están pendientes de dar seguridad jurídica. También la culminación sobre estos procesos lo haremos a través de la coordinación de las diferentes entidades. Entonces, que nos limita un poco la pandemia y la distancia, porque Loreto es un poco inaccesible por la calidad del suelo y las montañas que tenemos. Sin embargo, es la región que más ha titulado acá en Perú y en Sudamérica. Es la que más se ha preocupado de llegar a los pueblos indígenas. Estamos trabajando con ellos permanentemente.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Finally, we have Julio Coserici, a past Goldman Prize winner, I noticed, and president of the Indigenous Federation of the Madre de Dios River and its tributaries, where many communities have been in isolation during the pandemic, I know. So Julio, can you tell us about that and how are they being protected?
Sí, muy buenos días. Gracias por la invitación de Tenure Facilite, que nos ha invitado a este importante evento. No sé si me están escuchando.
Sí, Julio, lo escuchamos muy bien. Siga, por favor.
Como representante de la FENAMAT, la Federación Nativa de Madre de Dios, que hemos sido los iniciadores históricos con el proyecto de Tenuri Facility con SPDA, en verdad hay que primero dar a conocer un importante trabajo en la seguridad territorial, pero no solamente seguridad territorial, sino también fortalecimiento de las capacidades institucionales, no de las organizaciones, pero también de las comunidades. Y esto con un enfoque desde la juventud, pero también el tema de las mujeres indígenas. Hemos, con este trabajo que ha sido un piloto, ¿no? Que hemos ido pues en Perú, Madre de Dios, con el TF, Tenuri Facility, ¿no? Esto nos ayudó a ver el tema de los derechos legales, ¿no? Con un equipo de asesoría, viendo los temas de las comunidades, pero también los temas de los pueblos indígenas en aislamiento, ¿no? Contacto inicial. Ahora en este tema de la pandemia también ha sido muy preocupante porque no hemos estado preparados, ni el gobierno ni nosotros, en atender la demanda de las comunidades, pero sin embargo creo que es importante, hemos montado un sistema de comunicación, ¿no? Por esta vía para estar más cerca de las comunidades, información mucho más que las instituciones públicas, y esto ha ayudado, ¿no? Que poder responder las diferentes demandas de las comunidades, pero no es la solución, porque la medicina no llega, los bonos no llegan, las canastas no llegan, y todo el tema de la educación impuesta para la ciudad, pero no para las comunidades. Entonces, estas cosas fortaleció mucho el proyecto, ¿no? Pero también un tema importante con algunos apoyos para participar a eventos internacionales también, ¿no? Por ejemplo, aquí hay que saludar inicialmente a Yani, después a Nonet, Paula Alvarado, que estamos muy cerca coordinando, ¿no? En eventos internacionales, como FENAMAT es tal vez pionero o hemos sido los iniciadores del proyecto piloto, hemos participado en eventos de planificación en Washington, también en el lanzamiento de la institucionalidad del TF, que ha sido en Estocolmo, también FENAMAT estuvo ahí, y luego una planificación también en Colombia, ¿no? Con el tema de una planificación de teoría del cambio. Creo que es importante el tema de que FENAMAT está más consolidado, pero creo que la demanda es más grande. Hay temas muy fuertes, todavía falta culminar el tema de la brecha en el tema de territorio, pero creo que es importante dar continuidad. Vamos a estar siempre activo y participando en este proceso del Tenori Facility, pero creo que también se abre muchas puertas, ¿no? De apoyo también seguramente en otros países de esta institución, pero desde FENAMAT saludamos que hemos aprendido también con llevar con aliados con el tema de SPDA, cada vez nos estamos comprendiendo y también están entendiendo que los pueblos indígenas decidimos, pero trabajamos en forma conjunta. Solamente eso como algo general, pero saludar desde los pueblos indígenas de Madre Dios la importancia del proyecto del TF y eso debe continuar. Gracias.
Thank you. Many thanks to all three of you. Again, if you have questions for them, then please address them to the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. Now we're moving on to Belize in Central America, where our focus will be on the tenure rights of the Mayan people. Their territories, of course, extend also into modern-day Guatemala and Mexico, but here is our film from southern Belize.
The Maya people of the southern district of Toledo in Belize are no strangers to adversity. For decades, they have fought a courageous battle against their own government to have their land rights recognized, eventually achieving an historic victory in the Caribbean Court of Justice in 2015. The tenure facility is now supporting its partners, the Julian Cho Society, the Toledo Alcaldes Association, the Maya Leaders Alliance, the Toledo Maya Land Rights Commission, and the University of Colorado Law School to implement that decision, securing Maya lands and the forests they depend on for generations to come.
Much of our work centers around community consensus building, community meetings, and community-led mapping of our indigenous territory. The restrictions on lockdown of COVID-19 has greatly impacted our ability to reach our communities and has greatly reduced our ability to effectively implement the project activities as was originally conceptualized. At the same time, we are faced with increased pressures of incursions on our land from agents of the state, from third-party interests, from opportunistic outsiders who recognize the community's inability to ward off these incursions during a global pandemic.
The Maya peoples knew they would largely have to rely on their own resources to ride out the storm of COVID-19. And with the entire world shutting down, there were real fears among Maya communities.
We were very scared about the COVID disease. Our land is very important to us as a Maya person. We have been lobbying with the government for many years now about our land rights. As a former president of the Toledo Alcaldes Association, I know that this kind of disease will not totally condemn us.
That the Maya still have their lands will be critical to their ability to survive this global catastrophe, and is vindication of everything the Tenure Facilities partners have fought for so long.
We have been able to develop a strategy that looks at community radio as the primary means or medium to reach our communities. We're also exploring various social media platforms, all within the limits and restrictions of technology and infrastructure within our remote and isolated communities.
During the pandemic, the communication with the leaders was through radio. It was also done through text messaging, and most importantly, by providing key information on the virus, on the pandemic, via pamphlets in a language that our communities would understand. What this response taught us is that we can assist our communities.
Like so many indigenous peoples around the world, the Maya have relied on a sense of community and solidarity to support each other through the first months of the pandemic. And the changes they are being forced to make are helping to prepare them for taking the project forward in a world changed by COVID-19.
At this moment, the villagers are looking forward for this land demarcation so that they can depend on their land to survive in many ways, peacefully.
Thank you. Excuse me, we have just one speaker from Belize today, who is Pablo Mis, who is from the Julian Cho Society, which was mentioned in the film. It's named after a hero of the Mayan social justice movement, and he's also from the Maya Leaders Alliance. Pablo, in theory, the Mayans have legal customary rights to their land, but I know that gaining implementation on the ground has been a big struggle. Please tell us more.
Thank you very much. Greetings to our brothers and sisters all over. It's a pleasure to be sharing with you. Indeed, going to the question that Fred has put forward, I first of all wanted to say that as we live through the COVID pandemic, I think it's important to emphasize that generally indigenous peoples have essentially been working hard to survive in an ever-ending pandemic. It's essentially our struggle. I want to quickly say then that perhaps the greatest challenge that we've seen from the experience of the Maya people when it comes to the implementation has to do with the never-ending need to be deliberate, to be consistent in sustaining negotiations. So negotiations is an ongoing need for Maya communities to be able to properly implement the land rights decision that is before us. I say that because as I listen as well to the presentation of many of our brothers and sisters, in particular Guyana, we will realize that constantly the rules of the games are changed. Constantly the goalpost, as I always say, is being moved, and you find us indigenous peoples trying to follow the goalposts all over, and that requires then that we're able to have the capacity, that indigenous peoples have the capacity to sustain deliberate, consistent negotiations with the state in order for affirmed rights to be realized and be implemented. So in following with that, then there's another element that I thought would be very important to share here. And again, I was listening very keenly to the presentation of Guyana, which we're able to relate with very much here. The issue of governance, I think, is fundamental to the success of indigenous revitalization. We are constantly trying to ensure that we preserve the autonomy, the integrity of our own system of governance. What is very clear to us here in Belize is that we will never be able to achieve the freedom, the liberty that our people desire for, the justice, the opportunity to innovate and to create a proper future for our people. We will never be able to achieve that if we do not have our own systems that are bound by the principles, the foundational teachings that makes us indigenous peoples. So we have worked very much intensely to ensure that the system of governance of the Maya people, which is our traditional alcaldes, Holomilik Alebal, or Polilka, are able to have the capacity, are able to be organized and be able to come around the table to engage in conversations, in dialogue, in consensus building on the way forward. So I think the point I wanted to emphasize there that equally, or perhaps most important, as we try to implement land rights, is the need to revitalize, to strengthen, to ensure that our own systems of governance are in place. It is not enough to be able to assimilate our system under existing infrastructures of the government. That in itself, essentially, as our leaders say, is giving up our voices, giving up our own ability to negotiate and to construct our own future.
Thank you, Pablo. Don't go away. I would like to have a follow-up question, if you're still there. Mayan people often use the phrase, the future we dream. I'm very interested to know what you mean by that and what the dream is and how you're going to bring it about.
Sure, and that's a very important question as well. And I would like to frame that the response in this context, that the implementation of land rights cannot be seen as a one-off project. It needs to be a part of the program of work to build indigenous futures. So in the case of the Maya people, we have collectively stated that our dream for the Maya future is one where we see ourselves as being peaceful people, hardworking people, a people with a resilient culture, a people that is utilizing technology along with our indigenous wisdom and philosophy, and also being able to leverage the resources that is around us. That's essentially the dream of the Maya people. So when we think of that, then the land rights implementation that we are working on with the Tenor facility is conceived within that framework, that it ought to be contributing to supporting the Maya people moving forward towards realizing their dream. In that sense, then, the work cannot be seen while we are doing demarcation, while we are developing legislation. It cannot be seen as projects.
Ha firmado convenios conjuntamente con AIDC, con el gobierno regional de Loreto, para llevar adelante la titulación de las comunidades
as a part of the implementation of or part of constructing the Maya future. So I wanted to make sure I highlighted that point. I think Jorge there contributed a little bit to our conversation.
En este caso, con el
okay,
apoyo
Pablo,
del
I think yes. I think maybe it's George is speaking now. Maybe somebody could turn him off.
Jorge, por
thank
favor,
you.
apague su micrófono. Jorge, por favor, apague su micrófono. Gracias.
Hello.
I'm still here, Fred.
Good. Okay, I think we're better now. Thank you. Thank you so much, Pablo. That was really very interesting. I need to move on now to from Belize to Colombia, a country recovering, as we all know, from a long civil war. The war which had grave implications for land tenure, but I think we're now discovering that the peace also has important implications for land tenure. So I hope we can hear more about that. We have 2 sessions on Colombia. Later, we'll be looking at the battles of the Afro-Colombian communities. That will be after the short break we have in a few minutes. But first, our film on securing the rights of the indigenous people of Colombia.
Colombia's 115 indigenous peoples have a deep relationship with their land, acting as guardians for approximately 60 million hectares in total. Less than a third of that land is secured by official titles. For decades, these same communities have borne the brunt of a long-running civil war, criminality, land grabbing, exploitation by powerful economic actors, and appalling human rights abuses. Even today, following the end of the war, the future is uncertain, and efforts to title 5 million hectares of land are hampered by systemic problems and low education levels within communities themselves.
Esto tiene grave consecuencia, porque la inseguridad hace que diferentes actores, llámanse económicos, grupos armados o actividades ilícitas o temas extractivos mineroenergéticos afectan y amenazan estos territorios. Y allí es el fundamento de muchos pueblos indígenas que en este momento no tienen esa seguridad jurídica en sus territorios.
The Tenure Facilities partners, the Indigenous Technical Secretary of the National Commission of Indigenous Territories, and the Association of Arhuacas Authorities of the Sierra Nevada, are working to overcome some of these obstacles, smoothing the process to quicken and scale up land claims from indigenous peoples. Coronavirus has not only placed this vital work on hold, but the nationwide lockdown has created conditions for a resurgence of much of the violence, marginalization, and abuse that have beset indigenous populations for so long. In May, the Ambera community in Dobida were forced to flee from paramilitary groups who were fighting for control of the region.
En la pandemia desde marzo hasta la fecha se incrementaron los asesinatos, se incrementaron las amenazas, se incrementó la deforestación en los territorios, se incrementaron las actividades mineroenergéticas y, por otra parte, el gobierno nacional en su atención al COVID no tuvo en cuenta temas que tuvieron que ver con la atención diferencial a pueblos indígenas. Por otra parte, también podemos decir que hubo acciones administrativas que se realizaron. Por ejemplo, se le quiere bajar la categoría en este momento al tema del ejercicio del derecho fundamental de la consulta previa porque lo quieren reglamentar. Es decir, se quiere instrumentalizar el derecho fundamental de la consulta previa como un requisito para otorgar licencias ambientales.
Meanwhile, project work has understandably been delayed in the face of travel restrictions and strict lockdowns.
El proyecto tenía una planificación, se había dividido en 2 partes, en la fase inicial y en la fase de implementación. Sin embargo, esto afectó la primera fase, que era todo el desarrollo de planificación, se querían hacer visitas a territorio. Sin embargo, esto no fue posible hacerla porque se restringieron a nivel nacional los viajes, tanto institucionales como gubernamentales.
However, the Tenure Facilities partners are well used to swimming against the tide, and so work is underway to adapt to new realities.
Marco de la implementación también es necesario la recolección de expedientes que contribuyan a mejorar la seguridad jurídica de los territorios. Por eso es necesario ese tema de diseñarse nuevas estrategias para ir a territorio, pero también para proteger esos territorios de COVID y de contagio que podemos someter en esa buena intención de ayudar. Y lo segundo, estas ayudas humanitarias también tienen que estar enfocadas a una atención diferencial a los pueblos indígenas que contribuya a fortalecer también su gobernabilidad, a proteger su autonomía, a proteger su cultura vista desde afuera, pero fortalecer son las bases del territorio.
Thank you. That was a very nice film, I think, that one. We have two speakers to discuss indigenous rights in Colombia. First up is Camilo Niño of the National Commission of Indigenous Territories. Camilo, please tell us more about the 10-year facility project, and perhaps particularly how it's been affected by the pandemic, which we heard a little bit about in the film.
Buenos días para todos y todas. Mi nombre es Camilo Niño. Actualmente soy el coordinador de la Comisión Nacional de Territorios Indígenas, un espacio muy importante de diálogo y concertación entre pueblos indígenas y gobierno nacional. He escuchado ponencias muy importantes, interesantes, experiencia de países, y quiero hoy extenderle un saludo a todos nuestros participantes. Qué bueno que estemos trabajando en temas comunes, como es el tema de garantizar la seguridad jurídica de los territorios indígenas. Y hoy quiero hablarle sobre, muchas personas de pronto no conocerán lo que es Colombia, por eso quiero extenderle un saludo aquí a los organizadores también, al TF, al Tenure Facility, por este tema. Quiero compartir unas pantallas, unas fotografías como para que se tengan una idea sobre de lo que voy a conversar. En primer lugar, vamos a abordar 3 puntos principales. Uno tiene que ver con en qué consiste la importancia de los territorios indígenas frente a la adaptación y mitigación del cambio climático. 2, cómo la inseguridad jurídica de los territorios indígenas afecta a la biodiversidad. Y tercero, de qué manera el contexto político impacta la tenencia colectiva para los pueblos indígenas en el marco de la pandemia. Todo esto es lo que estamos abordando y vamos a abordar en el marco del proyecto que actualmente estamos trabajando de manera conjunta con nuestros aliados y cooperantes en cabeza del Tenure Facility. Colombia en este momento tiene 115 pueblos indígenas, donde lo amarillo en el mapa muestra que son los resguardos que actualmente tienen una seguridad jurídica que está alrededor de 33.257.000 hectáreas aproximadamente en 769 resguardos indígenas, que es la forma de la tenencia colectiva, lo que ya tienen una seguridad jurídica. Y nosotros como pueblos indígenas representamos el 4.4 del total de la población nacional, que estamos alrededor ya cerca de los 2 millones de individuos o de población indígena, eso según el censo del 2018 que lo hizo la Dirección Nacional de Planeación. Sin embargo, de pronto nos dicen, oh, pero es que tienen mucha tierra, 33 millones de hectáreas, 28% del país. Esa es una discusión que ha sido también tomada por políticos para decir que los pueblos indígenas somos terratenientes. Sin embargo, cuando hacemos un análisis mucho más profundo, vemos, por ejemplo, que el 62% de todo ese territorio nacional que está titulado para pueblos indígenas es para conservación y que solo el 3% tiene vocación agropecuaria, lo que es para ganadería y tema de agricultura, el 3% del total que se ha titulado. Entonces, esto es muy importante que se tenga en cuenta. Y segundo, el 82% de esas 33 millones de hectáreas pertenecen a bosques húmedos tropicales. Es decir, es allí donde está todo el stock de carbono, todo el tema de son ecosistemas importantes en el tema de adaptación y mitigación al cambio climático. Entonces vemos que uno de los principales ecosistemas estratégicos para Colombia, para la humanidad, están en los territorios indígenas, y ahí presentamos algunas cifras que por tema de tiempo no me voy a detener a leerlo, pero el mensaje que quiero dar es, de ese total, el 82% es bosque y cobertura natural y seminatural está en el 16%. Si nosotros hacemos una comparación de los dos mapas, este que está a mi lado izquierdo de la pantalla representan los resguardos que actualmente están titulados como bajo figura de resguardo, que tienen figura jurídica. De mi lado derecho es donde están los bosques. Entonces hay una relación entre bosques y resguardos. Eso es para que se tenga en cuenta la importancia que revisten los resguardos frente a la mitigación y adaptación del cambio climático, porque son estratégicos. Entonces, no todo lo que está titulado sirven para el tema del tema agropecuario o agrícola, sino la mayor parte es forestación. Sin embargo, nosotros hoy en Colombia, y es uno de los temas que vamos a trabajar en el marco del proyecto que estamos implementando, existen muchas solicitudes. Es decir, los 33 millones de hectáreas que actualmente están tituladas no son suficientes, porque las tierras donde tienen una vocación agrícola o pecuaria no están en manos de pueblos indígenas. Entonces, en este momento, tenemos un vacío de información porque no sabemos exactamente cuántas hectáreas son las que los pueblos indígenas estamos solicitando. Esta es una proyección en el mapa que encontramos, una proyección sobre dónde son los municipios y departamentos en la cual estamos haciendo esas solicitudes. Entonces, hay más de 1000 solicitudes, y una de las falencias que tenemos es un vacío de información, donde hablamos que aproximadamente aquellas que tienen información, 400 solicitudes, suman aproximadamente 3.500.000 hectáreas. Sin embargo, aquí entro a responder la segunda pregunta, es cómo la inseguridad jurídica de los territorios indígenas afecta a la biodiversidad. Como no existe seguridad jurídica en donde se están titulando, entonces empiezan los problemas. Aquí en este mapa queremos reflejar es dónde los bloques petroleros se están solicitando. Tenemos problemas, por ejemplo, por aquí en Putumayo, que es en esta parte, donde existen bloques petroleros, solicitudes de exploración y explotación de petróleo que se están traslapando o están encima ya de resguardo constituido. Y sobre todo también se están dando sobre lugares donde los pueblos indígenas están solicitando para que se dé seguridad jurídica. Que no exista seguridad jurídica no quiere decir que no haya pueblos indígenas, ya hay ocupación y uso de esos territorios, de esos espacios, sino que se requiere que se garanticen jurídicamente eso. Ahora, en mi lado derecho, en el siguiente mapa, están los títulos y solicitudes mineras. Entonces, toda la parte amarilla son solicitudes mineras y lo que está en parte roja son los títulos que actualmente existen. Entonces, de la misma manera que en el mapa anterior, vemos cómo se empiezan a traslapar ya resguardo constituido que ya tienen seguridad jurídica con solicitudes mineras, y también existen solicitudes que se están dando sobre los que estamos solicitando. Este que traigo aquí es un ejemplo. Esto está sucediendo en Orinoquía. En la Orinoquía colombiana se quiere implementar la zona de reservas industriales agropecuarias. Entonces, aquí existe algo complejo y se quieren implementar grandes zonas industriales agropecuarios y se están traslapando con resguardo que están constituidos. Por ejemplo, en esta parte, toda la altillanura de lo que le hablo están traslapadas con con esas zonas de interés que se quiere implementar. Pero ahí mismo sobre esa zona, por ejemplo, aquí donde se ve como con esta rayita, es donde estamos solicitando que se protejan, que se garantice esa protección. Esos son ejemplos de los conflictos territoriales que se vienen dando al interior. Eso que ha generado, y es que se hayan incrementado los asesinatos a líderes indígenas, a líderes sociales. Y esto se da más que todo porque ha habido un incremento en los asesinatos en la zona donde estamos solicitando y más en zonas donde es de interés para la protección, pero también donde son zonas que por el narcotráfico o por aquí, yo le estaba hablando de la altillanura, es esta parte. Aquí se ha venido exacerbando todo el tema de la complejidad que hay en el tema de los asesinatos, pero también el tema de la deforestación se ha venido en aumento. Entonces hay una relación entre lo que estamos solicitando, el tema de seguridad jurídica versus el tema de asesinatos. Ahora bien, la compañera Julie, que me va a anteceder en la presentación, nos va a hablar qué ha pasado en el marco de la pandemia. Todo esto que le estoy hablando es lo que queremos abordar en el marco del proyecto, que se visibilice los problemas, se agilicen los procesos de seguridad, porque Colombia, si bien se tiene un marco normativo fuerte, su implementación es compleja. Colombia hoy día atraviesa por un momento complejo en términos de violación de derechos humanos y en términos de exterminio físico de los pueblos indígenas. Por eso no es tan esperanzador el tema de los pueblos indígenas en este momento en Colombia, a pesar que se viene un proceso de implementación del proceso de paz. Por eso quiero darle aquí la intervención a la compañera Julie para que nos complemente con la siguiente pregunta.
Thank you, Camilo. Julie, yes, please go ahead and give us your thoughts. Thank you.
Bueno, muchas gracias. Primero que todo, buenas tardes para todos y para todas. Estas reflexiones que queremos compartir desde Colombia, como mencionaba Paula al inicio y en el video, pues efectivamente nuestro proyecto se enmarca en la implementación también del acuerdo de paz. Sin embargo, pues la implementación no ha sido como muchas veces la estábamos esperando, ¿no? Yo quisiera puntualizar a partir de lo que mencionó Camilo. Colombia es el país de América Latina que presenta más desigualdad y concentración de la tierra. Esto es bastante importante en términos de una concentración, por ejemplo, con un índice de Gini del 0.897, lo cual nos ubica a nivel de América Latina como el país más inequitativo en la distribución de la tierra y que explica la historicidad de los conflictos por la tierra y la causa misma del conflicto armado en Colombia. De igual forma, de acuerdo con el informe publicado por Global Witness, Defender el Mañana, Colombia ocupa el primer puesto a nivel mundial con más asesinatos de líderes y lideresas asesinados por la defensa del territorio y del medio ambiente. Y en este informe se resalta que el 30% de los asesinatos a nivel mundial corresponden a Colombia y la mitad han sido dirigidos contra miembros de pueblos indígenas. Y como mencionaba Camilo, la población indígena es tan solo el 4%, lo cual ustedes podrán imaginar el impacto que tiene el asesinato de líderes y lideresas indígenas en sus comunidades y en el país. En el marco del confinamiento, pues anotar, Colombia tuvo un confinamiento cercano a los 6 meses, 5 meses y medio, desde el 25 de marzo hasta el 31 de agosto. Y en este marco del confinamiento, esperábamos que las medidas del gobierno nacional fueran progresivas en la protección del derecho al territorio, dado que en este contexto de pandemia los territorios son fundamentales para la soberanía y la pervivencia de los pueblos indígenas. Sin embargo, ¿qué observamos? Al contrario, se han venido adoptando diferentes medidas administrativas y de política pública que son regresivas de los derechos territoriales. Y en este contexto también de la pandemia, evidenciamos en Colombia un cambio, y es en términos que hay una crisis institucional del Estado colombiano. Estamos ante un contexto de consolidación del autoritarismo, de concentración de poderes, en términos que no hay una separación clara de los poderes y de los organismos de control. Todos están, digamos, bajo el partido de gobierno y serias tensiones con la rama judicial, lo cual afecta aún más las garantías del acceso a la justicia y la defensa de la vida de todos y todas quienes somos defensores de derechos humanos. Entonces, este contexto parte, digamos, que se refuerza en este contexto de pandemia y que va acompañado de grandes ejemplos de abuso policial y de la fuerza pública en los diferentes territorios. Entonces, en el marco de una investigación que adelantamos en el Observatorio de Monitoreo de los Derechos Territoriales de los Pueblos Indígenas, en este contexto de pandemia identificamos dos ejes: una violencia de tipo legal, de tipo administrativo, que fueron esas medidas que tomó el gobierno colombiano, más que todo favoreciendo la economía extractiva principalmente y desdibujando por completo la implementación del acuerdo de paz y su capítulo étnico. Como mencionaba Camilo anteriormente, una de estas era la reforma a la consulta previa para favorecer, digamos, grandes proyectos. Y también, pues, otra de las medidas que ha tomado el Ministerio de Defensa es la intención de reactivar las fumigaciones con glifosato para erradicar, como una forma de erradicar cultivos de uso ilícito. Pues como ustedes saben, el uso de este pesticida es bastante peligroso para la salud de las comunidades, pero también en un contexto de pandemia puede someter a las comunidades a la hambruna, en tanto se afecten también sus cultivos de pan coger. El Ministerio del Interior ignora por completo la presencia de comunidades indígenas en las zonas que se pretende fumigar, a lo cual en el marco de la Secretaría Técnica Indígena se radicaron tutelas para decir lo contrario, que sí hay una presencia de pueblos indígenas. Identificamos un traslape de cerca de 1 millón de hectáreas que se podrían ver afectadas y que son de territorios indígenas. Y en esta medida, digamos que jueces han tratado de detener esta iniciativa. Sin embargo, hay ciertos incidentes de desacato por parte del gobierno nacional. Y otro tercer punto que podemos observar es la continuación de ese interés del gobierno nacional de militarizar el país, de reforzar su política de seguridad, y en el marco de la pandemia, aprovechando el estado de emergencia y alterando ciertos procedimientos administrativos y legales, se permite la llegada de bases militares norteamericanas a Colombia. Ya habían anteriormente, pero llegan nuevas con una finalidad asesora para combatir el narcotráfico, y se ubican en unas zonas llamadas Futuro. Estas zonas principalmente se encuentran ubicadas en territorios con una alta conflictividad, donde se está dando un escalamiento del conflicto, como mencionaba Camilo en los mapas, con fuerte presencia de grupos armados, y ahora digamos que se está militarizando estos territorios, principalmente hacia el suroccidente
Julie,
colombiano.
I think we're going to have to wind up now. Can somebody tell Julie we need to wind up, because we have to have a short break before the next session. My apologies,
Julie.
but if you could wind up.
Julie, mil disculpas, pero tenemos que cortar en este momento lo que tú estás explicando,
Sí,
porque
ya
estamos
voy
con
para
poco de
allá.
tiempo. Gracias, Julie.
Ok, y efectivamente se continúa con este proceso de militarización. Y el segundo punto que identificamos, el segundo eje de violencia sociopolítica, fue un incremento en el 37% de los asesinatos contra miembros de pueblos indígenas en el contexto de la pandemia. Al igual como mencionaban, digamos, se están dando desplazamientos y confinamientos y fuertes confrontaciones con la fuerza pública ante la implementación de la erradicación forzada de cultivos de uso ilícito. De igual forma, pues nosotros observamos que en el marco de la pandemia son muchos los desafíos que hay y que este contexto está afectando el diálogo político con el gobierno nacional para avanzar en estas solicitudes que mencionaba Camilo y que, digamos, dificultan avanzar en estos procesos de titulación, y por eso, digamos, la importancia de este tipo de proyectos que fortalecen a la Comisión Nacional de Territorio como un escenario de diálogo político. Muchas gracias y disculpen si me extendí un poco del tiempo.
No problem, Julie. Thank you very much indeed. It was very interesting material from Colombia. We now have a short break, a very short break. Please don't go away. We'll be back in, I would say, 4 minutes to resume the second part of our session on Colombia when we look at people of African descent. So we are now having a 4-minute break, but please don't go away. Okay, that's great. Welcome back. Thank you very much for staying with us. Just a reminder that we have a panel session coming up with all of our speakers and with questions from you. So please, if you haven't, please send in your questions. But first, we're back to Colombia with our second look with our video specifically on Afro-Colombian land rights. Here's the video.
First arriving in South America as slaves during a brutal colonial period, Afro-descendant communities in Colombia have, over the centuries, developed deep ties to the land they have worked. Despite this, they have continued to suffer from racism and prejudice, and few communities suffered more during the country's long-simmering conflict, which finally ended in 2016. The Tenure Facility's partners, the Black Communities Process, in association with the University of Javeriana, the National Land Agency, and the National Afro-Colombian Peace Association, have been working to secure territorial rights for 1.5 million people, reducing tensions over land. Not only has the pandemic slowed the vital work of land tenure, it has disrupted the cultural and economic lives of the communities.
La producción de nuestras comunidades se disminuyó, porque muchas de nuestras comunidades tienen contactos comerciales con otros pueblos. En ausencia de esos contactos comerciales, hubo un impacto muy fuerte en la economía de cada una de esas comunidades y eso también impactó negativamente esa realidad.
Realizing the situation was likely to remain serious for some time, the Tenure Facility's partners looked to change the way they worked and the way they interacted with communities.
Sabíamos que era urgente y perentorio tomar acciones y mientras fuimos buscando mecanismos y rutas para retomar el trabajo de la titulación colectiva de las tierras, esto implicó, digámoslo, reuniones sucesivas con la Agencia Nacional de Tierras y con las comunidades para ir buscando, ir construyendo alternativas. En este marco logramos ya mucho más cerca a este momento construir un protocolo de bioseguridad, ¿cierto?, que garantizara para todas las partes involucradas condiciones para poder regresar a campo a hacer las actividades propias de la titulación colectiva que exige la norma.
Afro-descendant organizations are well used to operating in the volatile and complex world of Colombian politics. Coronavirus has created challenges, but also opportunities to streamline the project's work to function even better in the future.
Para escenarios futuros contamos con importantes aprendizajes derivados de esta situación. El primero es que reconocimos la importancia de canales robustos de comunicación entre todas y todos, sin importar el lugar geográfico en el que nos encontremos. Asimismo, reforzamos nuestra metodología descentralizada de trabajo y finalmente conocimos los alcances del trabajo virtual. Esta como una herramienta que sirve para cortar brechas, reconociendo pues que hay escenarios y actividades que requieren de lo presencial y al mismo tiempo que no todas las comunidades pueden acceder a este canal de comunicación. Asimismo, buscaremos dar cuenta de las necesidades diferenciadas que tienen los territorios y de los nuevos escenarios que se van abriendo con el tiempo. Y finalmente, como equipo del proyecto de titulación colectiva, buscaremos que nuestro sistema de información geográfico y toda la información que hemos recopilado sea cada vez más participativo y se construya cada vez más de la mano con las comunidades.
Okay, again, we have two speakers to discuss Afro-Colombian land rights in Colombia. First is Eddie Johanna Cerón of the Black Communities Process. She works on youth coordination, so welcome. Please, can you talk to us as well about the effects of the pandemic on territories of Black communities and on some of the youth aspects, please.
Muy buenos días y buenas tardes donde ya es de tarde. Yo qué puedo decir, desde el proceso de comunidades negras, creo que uno de los grandes efectos de la pandemia fue como la agudización de las condiciones de vulnerabilidad que ya tenían nuestras comunidades. Entonces, en el marco, por ejemplo, de las actividades de este convenio, nosotros tuvimos que vernos en la necesidad de realizar un diagnóstico de las condiciones en que estaban nuestras comunidades. Y a partir de este diagnóstico que hicimos con nuestros enlaces regionales, nos pudimos dar cuenta de la vulnerabilidad que había frente al acceso a un desarrollo productivo agropecuario estable, a la protección de la vida e integridad de los líderes de las comunidades negras, al problema que había con el sistema de salud porque no garantiza los elementos básicos de prevención y protección frente a una pandemia, como la seguridad alimentaria se vio amenazada porque muchas de nuestras comunidades quedaron confinadas y esto hacía como que las relaciones de trueque e intercambio que habían con otras comunidades no se pudieran llevar a cabo. Otra cosa que hizo que se agudizara esta situación fue el costo de los insumos y materias primas, porque esto dificultaba como el desarrollo de algunas actividades de producción agrícola. Entonces, de alguna forma, esto afectó la generación de ingresos de la gente en la comunidad y hacía que se vieran expuestas a realizar otras actividades y pudieran contraer el virus, porque no tenían las condiciones óptimas para llevar a cabo el aislamiento obligatorio que exige el gobierno nacional. Ahora, es de resaltar que, aunque las condiciones fueron bastante pesadas y siguen siendo bastante difíciles, la respuesta de las comunidades fue muy rápida. La gente tuvo la capacidad de crear planes de contingencias inmediatos que de alguna forma ayudaron a minimizar los impactos en estas comunidades. Y es allí donde, digamos, como desde el proceso de comunidades negras hemos estado apoyando a la realización de estas actividades y hemos estado como manteniendo contacto directo con una guardia cimarrona en cada una de estas comunidades porque son ellos los que están haciendo el seguimiento a los planes de contingencia que surgieron en el marco de la pandemia y son ellos los que han estado como también evaluando cómo se está llevando a cabo el aislamiento obligatorio que exige el gobierno nacional. A partir, por ejemplo, de este diagnóstico que les menciono, nosotros apoyamos con la entrega de ayudas alimentarias a madres cabezas de familia, creación de huertas comunitarias para fortalecer esto de la soberanía alimentaria, fortalecimiento de fincas agrícolas y dotación de elementos de bioseguridad a las comunidades y a la Guardia Cimarrona. Esto porque muchas de nuestras comunidades quedan aisladas, entonces no tenían acceso a elementos de bioseguridad que se encontraban en zonas urbanas. Entonces allí fue muy importante el trabajo de nuestros enlaces regionales que se vieron en la necesidad de llegar de manera presencial a las regiones para hacer entrega de estos elementos. En cuanto al trabajo juvenil, desde la instancia organizativa de jóvenes, nosotros hemos estado apoyando en la creación de huertas urbanas. ¿Por qué? Porque a partir del confinamiento, la brecha que había entre zonas urbanas y rurales, digamos que se amplió. Y como había una relación de campo poblado en donde las zonas rurales abastecían de productos a las zonas urbanas, Entonces, esto hacía que las zonas urbanas ya no tenían productos agrícolas. Entonces, la idea de nuestras huertas urbanas era que la gente pudiera autoabastecerse de estos alimentos para que si la pandemia se agudizara, no tuviéramos como esta crisis alimenticia por la que estábamos pasando. Eso por el lado de jóvenes. En cuanto al urbano, desde los jóvenes también estuvimos como apoyando en capacitaciones para el uso de elementos de bioseguridad, porque como no es una situación con la que nuestras comunidades estuvieran familiarizadas, entonces era necesario como concientizar a la gente de la situación actual por la que estamos viviendo. Esto teniendo en cuenta que muchas de nuestras comunidades no tienen acceso a medios de comunicación y están muy aisladas, no tienen redes eléctricas y demás. Entonces, esto hace que no estuvieran tan al tanto de la situación mundial por la que empezamos a pasar desde el mes de marzo. Bueno, como nosotros no podíamos como detenernos solamente a atender como estas situaciones de emergencia y debíamos cumplir con unos compromisos frente a la titulación que la gente de alguna forma nos estaba solicitando, nosotros creamos un protocolo de bioseguridad con consejos comunitarios y con la Universidad Javeriana, el cual nos permitió ingresar a campo en el mes de agosto, lo cual fue una experiencia muy bonita porque nos permitió evidenciar que la gente de verdad se preparó muy bien para enfrentar esta situación y para recibirnos en campo. Entonces no solo es como resaltar las afectaciones que tuvo, sino como la capacidad que tuvo nuestra gente desde su autonomía de enfrentar una pandemia nacional. Esto teniendo en cuenta que son territorios en donde la presencia nacional, bueno, del Estado nacional es poca, entonces la gente de alguna forma está muy fuerte en esto de, digamos, de la resiliencia, de hacerle frente a situaciones que de alguna forma afectan el desarrollo de la vida diaria en comunidad. A partir de esa experiencia que tuvimos con la visita técnica en el mes de agosto, nosotros pudimos construir un cronograma de trabajo con la Agencia Nacional de Tierras para poder seguir realizando otras visitas antes de que se acabe el año. Entonces, probablemente durante
Thank
el mes
you.
de noviembre...
I'm sorry, I think probably we need to wrap up this if you could very briefly. Thank you.
Okay.
You may carry on for a few more seconds, but we need to finish. Thank you.
No, sí, ya estoy terminando. Solo era para aclarar que...
All right. Okay. Okay. Look, thank you very much. I'm sorry to move things on, but we need to have time for the panel session. Our last speaker, we did plan to have Johanna Herrera from the Javeriana University, but she is sick with COVID-19, I'm afraid. So in her place at short notice, we have Cristian Guerrero, also of the university. Cristian, please tell us about the work of the students from the university during the lockdown, and perhaps also about the conservation opportunities in these territories. Thank you.
Bueno, un gusto saludarles de nuevo. Qué bueno que nos podamos encontrar a pesar de las circunstancias. Voy a iniciar respondiendo la segunda pregunta frente a las oportunidades de conservación que nos presentan los territorios habitados por las comunidades negras en Colombia. Y quiero iniciar diciendo que vale la pena mencionar que la política de titulación colectiva a comunidades negras inició muy relacionada con una apuesta por la conservación de bosques y ecosistemas estratégicos. En efecto, las áreas ya tituladas a comunidades negras, que suman alrededor de 5 millones de hectáreas, están compuestas por un 82% de ecosistemas de bosque, manglar, ciénagas, lagos y ríos. No obstante, es necesario preguntarse un poco qué pasa con esos territorios que continúan sin ser titulados y en cuáles ecosistemas se ubican. Y un poco quisiéramos comentarles que en el marco del proyecto que hemos venido adelantando de la mano del proceso de comunidades negras y de la Agencia Nacional de Tierras y apoyado por el Tenure Facility, hemos logrado caracterizar 351 solicitudes de titulación colectiva que siguen sin ser atendidas por parte del Estado colombiano, ubicadas en 22 departamentos en regiones estratégicas del país. Y podemos decir, con la información que hemos procesado, que de esas 351 solicitudes de titulación colectiva, el 82,6% se encuentran ubicados en bosques, el 2,6% en ecosistemas de manglar y alrededor del 9,1% en ciénagas y lagos. Hemos logrado entender, o tenemos una hipótesis y una tesis muy comprobada, que las prácticas de conservación y de relacionamiento que tienen las comunidades negras con sus territorios han demostrado ser más efectivos para la conservación de bosques y ecosistemas. En efecto, el reconocimiento de la propiedad colectiva de comunidades étnicas en Colombia como mecanismo de protección de ecosistemas estratégicos ha logrado tener un mayor éxito que incluso las políticas de demarcación de áreas protegidas, en las cuales se presentan altos índices de deforestación, como lo comentaba Camilo, de la Comisión de Territorios Indígenas. ¿Por qué? Porque los planes de vida y el manejo que hacen las comunidades étnicas de estos territorios facilitan el cuidado y la regulación en el uso de los recursos naturales y, por supuesto, la pervivencia y supervivencia cultural de estas comunidades en los territorios. A pesar de la poca efectividad que tienen la demarcación de áreas protegidas en algunas regiones de Colombia, este modelo de conservación es uno de los retos a los que se enfrentan las comunidades étnicas a la hora de asegurar la tenencia jurídica de sus tierras, aun cuando las medidas de mitigación y adaptación son más efectivas en los territorios de comunidades étnicas basados en los manejos que hacen las comunidades de sus territorios. Los territorios de las comunidades étnicas presentan una oportunidad porque deben ser entendidos como una estrategia que permite mejores escenarios de gestión y conservación ambiental. No obstante, es necesario, y quizás ahí respondo parte de la primera pregunta, es necesario que los procesos de titulación apunten también a generar mejores formas de gobernanza local. Porque la titulación y el aseguramiento de la tenencia es solo el primer paso. Y quizás en ese sentido, los jóvenes que finalmente serán quienes habiten esos territorios y quienes sigan gestionando los recursos serán fundamentales y son fundamentales. De hecho, parte del trabajo que se ha desarrollado en el marco del proyecto ha intentado vincularlos con herramientas de información que permiten el intercambio en tiempo real de información y la demarcación de sus mismos territorios, logrando no solo un intercambio en términos de conocimiento, sino también un relevo generacional importante. Yo creo que en este momento es necesario mencionar algo que quizás comentaba Eni, y es la capacidad de resiliencia que han tenido las comunidades negras en sus territorios y que de alguna manera les ha permitido, a través del establecimiento de formas de gobierno local y de mecanismos de gobernanza de sus territorios, resistir a modelos extractivos legales e ilegales, que de alguna manera han permitido que ellos resistan y sean resilientes y en algunos casos conserven las pocas tierras y resistan a procesos de despojo de sus recursos naturales. Y creo que eso es importante, no solo por la victimización de la que mencionaban nuestros compañeros de la Comisión Nacional de Territorios Indígenas, sino por el cuidado que, a pesar de las condiciones del conflicto armado genera en estas comunidades, las comunidades negras continúan ejerciendo sobre sus territorios. Quizás para finalizar y un poco siendo respetuoso con el tiempo, quisiera decir que en síntesis es posible afirmar que las oportunidades de conservación en los territorios ocupados por comunidades negras no solo radican en los ecosistemas potenciales que ellos ocupan, sino en las formas y mecanismos de manejo ambiental que ellos implementan y que surgen en armonía con los planes de vida y con el relacionamiento que tienen estas comunidades étnicas con sus territorios, y que por supuesto se robustecen en la medida en que mecanismos como la Guardia Cimarrona, mecanismos como la Asamblea del Consejo Comunitario o asociaciones departamentales tienen la oportunidad de salvaguardar sus territorios y tienen la oportunidad de ejercer una gobernanza adecuada a partir de una suerte de saberes que han probado ser mucho más efectivos para la conservación ambiental, y que por supuesto nuestra apuesta es continuar transmitiéndolos e involucrando jóvenes a esta apuesta de gobernanza, haciéndola cada vez más participativa e inclusiva.
Thank you. Excellent, Christian. Thank you very much, and thank you for keeping to time. We now have 25 minutes left for the panel discussion. We finished our country presentations. I hope all our speakers, or most of them, including our keynote speaker today, David Kamowitz, are online because he's getting the first question. So I'm hoping we have some good questions around the issue of land rights, climate mitigation, and biodiversity protection. We have, I think, 5 questions, so basically everybody will get 5 minutes to answer, 5 minutes maximum, I should say. David, the question for you, what would be the best way to make the policy and lawmakers value the contribution of indigenous peoples as guardians of the forests? Do you have some examples of effective ways of doing that?
I mean, I think it's a mixture of information and informing and presenting the evidence from sources that are credible to them, with pressure from the indigenous and Afro-descendant peoples themselves, but also pressure from everyone who's concerned with climate and biodiversity. We have to raise the level of awareness of people that forests and maintaining these forests are fundamental to the climate change issue. They're not just a secondary or tertiary issue related to compared to energy. To address climate change in the world, we are going to need to address fossil fuels, but we absolutely need to address the forest issue as well. If we are able to convince all of the forces out there that believe in the need to respond to climate change, that forests are fundamental for that, and that indigenous and Afro-descendant peoples' territories are fundamental for the forest piece, then we will be able to greatly increase both the pressure and also the funding, because governments will respond to a certain extent to funding from the international community. It is not easy. There are very strong interests in trying to grab the ancestral territories of indigenous peoples and Afro-descendants for, as I said, many interests, from mining to oil to drug trafficking to ranching. It is hard to say how the pandemic is going to affect this process. That's something I'm working on in a separate context, but the relations are very complex. So we can't say that the pandemic is going to push policymakers to solve the problem, but we can't really say the opposite either. There are going to be forces related to the pandemic, related to the global economic crisis, that move in either ways. But we're going to have to, just to finish again, a mixture of, one, building the evidence and making that evidence widely available. 2, mobilization by indigenous and Afro-descendant peoples and their allies. And 3, building alliances between the indigenous peoples and Afro-descendants and their allies with other organizations and other social groups that are concerned with climate and the environment. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Did I hear you say in there something that the pandemic might be part of the solution to the problem? That would be controversial. I'll let people think about that.
Well, just to say very briefly that in the past, some economic crises have actually reduced pressure on forests, because there's much less demand for the minerals and less demand for the oil and the agricultural products. And there's also less money available for infrastructure projects. But in the current context, that doesn't seem to be playing itself out that way.
Okay, well, that's something to keep an eye on. Thank you very much, David. I'm going to move on to Gian LaRose in Guyana. The question for you, is the government in Guyana open or willing to formally recognize the indigenous traditional councils as part of the indigenous people governing system, or are they still resisting that?
Well, when in one of the revisions of the Amerindian Act in 2006, in fact, it was included in the revised act that a recognition of the indigenous councils. In other words, a process where the councils could be formally recognized was included in the Amerindian Act. So legally, there is some provision there that takes into account these councils. The actual organizing itself was a bit more problematic, because there had been a history of trying to keep down, not to recognize, and so forth, these councils. So it came out of a history of that, but more recently, yes, as to show Nicholas said, his council is one that was registered previously, because there's a process for a formal registration. With this current government, we've had a change of government. So with this current government, we are now beginning the process of reminding them about their commitment to recognizing these councils. And therefore, we think that it will work once we have good conversations and we have good dialogue. So the key to doing this is to work with the communities. Behind the scenes, what the communities have been doing is they have been talking among themselves. They have been formulating their various mandates and procedures, and they have been discussing their rules for governance and a number of things, incorporating traditional systems with some of the more formal governmental systems. So we feel that the formal registration process will go forward.
Thank you very much. That's interesting. I'm going to move on now to Julio Cusarici in Peru. Julio, how do you plan to get the state to support indigenous peoples' territorial claims in the context of so much political change, obviously even more going on in the last couple of days? How do you plan to get the state to support indigenous peoples' territorial claims in this context?
Fred, Julio seems to have left the room. Bear with us 1 second.
Okay. We'll wait just a second to see if we can find Julio, but if not, we'll carry on.
Please carry on with the next one.
Okay, in which case I'm going to move on to Jorge Perez. Jorge, if you're there, what has been the role of your organization for the titling of the Loreto communities? And how does this scenario look like now going forward?
George seems to have left as well.
George has gone too. Okay, all right. Is Nicholas Frederick here still here?
Yes.
He is. Excellent. Nicholas, good. So we're back in Ghana again. How long does it take to legally register peasant, if that's the right language, peasant land? How long did it take before, and how long does it take now? Perhaps you can talk us a little bit through the process. I know it's a complicated process, but tell us where you are and how many years, how many decades even maybe it takes. Hello, Nicholas, are you there?
He's still here in the room, but he seems not to be listening at the moment. Bear with us.
If not, I will ask Jeanne Larose to address that question from Guyana if she's still here. But let's see if we can find Nicholas.
Yes, I'm still here.
Okay, hang on a minute, Jeanne. We'll see if we can find Nicholas. But if he has gone, then I'll ask you to. Did you hear the question?
Yes, I did.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, can you repeat, please?
Nicholas. Oh, good.
Hello.
We
Sorry
had
about that.
good. I'm glad we found you. We had a question from the audience, as it were. How long does it take to legally register land? How long did it take before and how long does it take now? I don't know whether we're talking months or years or even decades, but perhaps you can talk to us about how long it takes.
Okay, so it all began prior to independence, to Guyana becoming an independent country,
yes,
where our ancestors laid claim to the territory, to the Wapichan territory. That was into like in the 1950s, 1960s. From then, there was a kind of a time when that was not being pursued until in the 80s and 90s, when in early 2000 when we started the mapping program, to 2016. However, the process is once the elders are involved that lay claim to the territory based on customary use and traditional practices, and you have that mapping program, then after the mapping program, you do the study as to how we manage the land traditionally, and then we did a 50-year plan as to how do we see we developing ourselves using the territory, the natural resources, and the knowledge available to develop ourselves based on our customary traditional practices. And once that system has been those activities has been done through the process, well, then you are now in a position to go to governments because you have your maps, you have all the information, and then there's no way that they can deny you your territorial rights. So it all depends on how quick and what knowledge exists, where do you start, and the political will, and how do you engage governments to accomplish this. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We hear from Julio again, or is Julio gone for good?
Fred, Julio is trying to reconnect, but we can go on with the questions and hopefully we get our colleagues from Peru back online soon.
All right, thank you. We have a question for Julio and we have a question for George. Is George around?
Jorge is also trying to reconnect.
Oh, see.
But
my apologies for my pronunciation.
That's okay. But we also have questions for all the panelists and for our colleagues from PCN in Colombia.
Yes. Thank you. It's potluck who gets to answer this, but does the panel have concrete advice or suggestions for Kunapip, who we heard from yesterday, which is in the process of graduating from the tenure facility? The key challenge is that Panama is a high-income country and its sovereign indigenous territories are marginalized in accessing the types of international financing that is most relevant to their priorities for territorial security and so on. So I wonder what approach they can take in Panama. How can they access advice and resources and so on when they maybe don't count among the world's poorest countries? I don't know. Maybe that's something which David would like to have a thought on. But I'm welcome to hear questions from anybody, answers from anybody on the panel. David, thank you.
No, I think that's a major problem. In some cases, middle-income countries like Panama can receive funding from multilateral banks, from the World Bank or for the Inter-American Development Bank for these sort of projects. that has its own problems, but some of that funding exists. The same with UN agencies. There may be going forward some philanthropic money for those countries. There hasn't been really in the past, but countries like Panama do face a major problem with getting funding for this work. I'll stop there.
Okay. I wonder if anybody else has any thoughts on that. Does Gian have any thoughts, or maybe from Pablo from Belize? Does anybody have any experience here that they can draw on in helping the people of Panama through this kind of difficult step? Nobody wants to contribute. That's fair enough. Pablo, yeah.
It is actually Cristina Koch, who is now talking, yes, from Belize.
Is
Cristina,
Pablo
your
going
microphone. Cristina, your microphone is closed. Please open your microphone.
Oh, sorry.
Pablo,
Fred,
thank you.
would you mind repeating that question?
Yes, we had a question asking on behalf of the people that we heard from yesterday from Panama about as a high-income country with sovereign indigenous territories marginalized, how can they access international financing to help with their work when, as a high-income nation, they clearly don't meet the requirements of some funding agencies? I'm not sure what your situation is in Belize, but I was wondering whether you might have had similar kinds of problems.
It is actually quite similar. Belize is not seen as, it's seen as more high end in terms of economic status.
Mm-hmm.
And so we face a similar dilemma. This is the irony, isn't it? A lot of times what gives indigenous communities the opportunity to really take the state at task for the full and effective recognition of indigenous people's rights to lands is when we are able to leverage our position by having support, financial support to bring cases to bear in the courts. For instance, a lot of times indigenous people struggle to be able to access these international and national court systems, primarily because they have the lack of finance to do so. And so when you're able to leverage that, for instance, this is why I think the 10-year facility is a critical partner for indigenous peoples, because even despite the fact that it's very difficult to secure those resources to go to the courts, it's even more important to recognize that the difficulty that indigenous people face to find the needed resources for effective implementation, which is really the central part of the realization of these rights. And so in Belize, that has been also our situation, where it's difficult to find these international funders. A lot of times, international funding comes directly to states, and the states have been the opponents of indigenous people's rights, have been those responsible for neglecting the recognition of indigenous people's rights. And so it's important to have international funding agencies that recognize that it's important to directly fund indigenous organizations, indigenous people's representative organizations, so that we can have the same kind of playing field as we negotiate the effective implementation of these rights. I want to stand with our brothers and sisters in Panama and recognize that we are also calling on all international funding agencies to recognize that it's difficult. And this is the most important part, the implementation of our rights, the effective implementation of our rights. I recognize that we are living in a third world region, but when you look at how Belize and Panama are treated, we're treated as if we are a part of the national, we're the same as the national citizenship, which the reality is that we are marginalized within our own countries. We don't have the same kind of economic leverage. And so that's critical for our international partners to consider and think as we reconstitute our funding agencies, as we reconstitute our funding strategies. I hope that has helped. I know I haven't provided the solutions, but I think that it's critical to recognize that a lot of us stand in the same boat, so to speak.
Okay, it's Christina, isn't it? My apologies for calling you Pablo earlier. That's the name on the bottom of the screen. I wasn't looking very carefully.
Okay, Fred.
Christina Koch,
That's
thank you very much indeed. Thank you. We had a question for our colleagues in the Colombian Afro-descendant communities, if they're still with us. The questioner asked, it seems very interesting to be the case of Peru, in which they have very detailed information regarding the number of communities and areas, and we saw the maps and the data earlier. But elsewhere, they're struggling with that very much because there's so much information missing. So I wonder maybe if Eni Cerón or Cristian Guerrero can think in some channels for how to share their experience in collecting this kind of data and making use of it, which clearly is possible in Colombia. Cristian, I see you there. That would be great to hear from you on that.
Bueno, muchas gracias por la pregunta. De hecho, este es uno de los elementos que nosotros trabajamos de manera ardua en el proyecto. Nosotros, desde el Observatorio de Territorios Étnicos y Campesinos, hemos construido un sistema de información geográfico y cualitativo que con el proyecto hemos logrado robustecer y que de alguna manera ha logrado como una estrategia para posicionar los datos y para recogerlos, lograr recabar tanto información oficial como información de las comunidades. Y tenemos toda una metodología para poder contrastarla, porque por supuesto a veces la información del Estado desconoce muchas de las realidades y las comunidades con su saber y su estar en el territorio, en sus territorios, en sus tierras, pues tienen toda una serie de información que de alguna manera necesita ser mostrada y que por supuesto nosotros hemos intentado con el sistema de información llevarla a las instancias del Estado. De hecho, vale la pena mencionar que en este momento el proyecto incluye un intercambio de información entre la entidad encargada de la administración de las tierras en Colombia y los datos que nosotros producimos que provienen de la gente. ¿Cómo hacemos esto? Pues bueno, tenemos una suerte de aplicaciones que nos permiten recabar información en terreno, también con el trabajo y la información que en las mismas visitas técnicas se producen, pero también a través de un ejercicio de mapeo local que después contrastamos con la información oficial y en la que nos damos cuenta de la suerte de errores. Quizás para mencionar un caso, por ejemplo, hemos logrado con este tipo de ejercicios ubicar aspiraciones territoriales que el Estado colombiano creía que estaban en el sur de un departamento y nos dimos cuenta que no, que estaban en el norte del departamento. Entonces, una suerte de estrategia quizás que nosotros hemos venido implementando es poder triangular la información y poder encontrar la manera de dar voz a la información local, pero por supuesto con estándares que permita que el Estado la reciba y con toda una reconstrucción, tanto desde el tema de los mapas y los datos, como de la narrativa local y por supuesto institucional. Ha sido un trabajo ya de casi 10 años desde el observatorio y que este proyecto nos ha permitido robustecer y hacer un poco más fuerte en términos metodológicos y también de tecnología, ¿no? Este sistema es libre, está abierto, por si lo quieren consultar, y pues en este intercambio de saberes vale la pena que quede ahí como eso. Está libre y disponible para todas y todos.
Cristian, thank you very much indeed. It's an interesting story how often community mapping projects reveal that their mapping is much better than central government mapping, and it's a very powerful tool when you can make that claim. Okay, our time is up on the panel. Thank you very much for the questions, and thank you very much for the panelists.
I'm sorry, Fred, to interrupt you, but we have Silvana Valdombino from SPDA in Peru, who will be answering the questions from Peru. If you could just give her 2 or 3 minutes. Unfortunately, Julio and Jorge have been drawn into to solve problems that are related to the last day situations with the presidency and all that.
Okay, so this was the question for Julio, yes?
Yeah, the question from Julio, and for Jorge,
Okay.
Silvana Valdomino will address them.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Silvana. I will have to ask you to be fairly brief, but the 2 questions that we had for Peru were, how do you plan to get the state to support indigenous people's territorial claims in a context of so much political change going on in the country right now? And I'll give you the second question as well, and perhaps you can answer them together. What has been the role of your organization for the titling of the Loreto communities? This was a question for Jorge, but maybe you can answer. And how does this scenario look now? So what is the role of the organization in titling the Loreto communities? Over to you, thank you.
Bueno, de nada, muy rápido. Respecto a la primera pregunta, yo creo que el fortalecimiento de las organizaciones indígenas en estos momentos tan difíciles para el país va a servir para que ellas sigan siendo los principales impulsores del otorgamiento de derechos a su favor. Hay un compromiso con el presidente, asumido por el presidente Vizcarra, pero se entiende que es un compromiso asumido como país. Entonces, las instituciones debemos exigir y solicitar que se cumpla la obligación asumida, que es el cierre de brechas de titulación de comunidades nativas en el Perú. Entonces, creo que el rol de las organizaciones y de todos aquellos involucrados es estar vigilante a que esa promesa se haga efectiva en lo que viene, porque ese es un compromiso hacia el bicentenario como país. Esa es la primera. Respecto a lo de Jorge, creo que el rol de las organizaciones indígenas ha sido muy fuerte para asegurar el cumplimiento de las obligaciones del Estado. Como explicó Jorge, el Estado es quien otorga los títulos a las comunidades, pero el empoderamiento de estas organizaciones, las capacidades técnicas, hace que ellos estén involucrados en los procedimientos y que puedan no solamente acompañar, sino exigir que se cumplan estas obligaciones y finalmente puedan lograr la consolidación de sus derechos. Nosotros, como Sociedad Peruana de Derecho Ambiental, ¿qué rol tenemos? Tenemos un rol articulador entre el Estado, las organizaciones indígenas y la sociedad civil para, desde diferentes frentes, buscar un objetivo común, ¿no? Que es la seguridad jurídica de los territorios de los pueblos indígenas. No sé si con eso respondí las 3 preguntas lo más rápido posible.
Silvana, that was splendid. Thank you very much. Thank you for standing in there. I'm going to have to call an end to the panel session now. We're out of time. I hope that most of the questions that were posed have been asked. I'd like to thank all the questioners and also the speakers. We're not in a room together to applaud them all, but I hope we can give them some virtual applause anyway. Tomorrow, at the same time, we return with presentations on 4 more countries, 2 in Asia, 2 in Africa. So we'll be hearing from India, Nepal, Mozambique, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. And tomorrow's theme will be securing women's collective land rights. But some final thoughts on today's discussions, and to wrap up proceedings, I'm going to hand over to Augusta Molnar of the Mountain Institute, who is also a board member of the tenure facility. So Augusta, what are your impressions on today? And I'll see everybody tomorrow.
Thank you all. This is really exciting. It's really an honor to be here. And there's so much that has happened in the last 2 days. I'm just simply going to try in the 5-6 minutes I have to just run through what are the issues I heard and what are the main points I heard. First, I heard partnerships. They're very key to the work, both among communities, so that indigenous communities and local communities who normally have no contact have contact, with government, with private sector, and the role that these empowering indigenous organizations and their allies have played in that. Second, technology. With the pandemic, mobile phones, radio, digital meetings, there's been a whole change of how people are communicating in this time and how they're combining physical contact with these other methods. There's been a delay. The mapping has been delayed even though the technologies are there. Third, Funders of the tenure facility are really key to the actors we're talking to. There has not been funds coming from the conventional donors or from a lot of the climate funds, the biodiversity funds, to these problems directly. And the other issue, of course, was this issue of in high income countries where indigenous organizations are really struggling to get funding. How do they get funders who think that the countries are not eligible to get funds? Fourth, resilience to the pandemic. It's include a lot of small farming and local food production for food security, as well as a major response from the knowledge on medicinal plants and the availability of medicinal plants when other PPE and other treatments were not available. Fifth, beyond COVID, this really raises the issue of what has been developed in response to COVID by communities is going to be really important when other challenges come. So we really need to get the countries and the public to recognize that. Seventh, threats. The major threats that are coming because private sector and government are signing deals without the necessary FPIC, without really recognizing the rights that are that already exist or that are being asked for. How do we handle this? All the speakers yesterday and today have talked about this a lot. Next, ratification that this learning exchange is unusual. There aren't very many programs that allow this kind of really strong learning between different projects and programs and countries. And it's very valuable. The question and answers, I think, in the chats really show how much people want to learn from each other's experiences and the large number of people here. The other thing that was striking was youth. Youth are coming home. They're coming home either because they don't have jobs or because they are seeking reaction to the COVID. And this means, number one, problems. We need to now incorporate these youth in and feed them, but it also means they've been helping with a lot of the work to recognize land rights, and they're also learning a lot about their indigenous knowledge and about their traditional practices that they might otherwise have been losing. The other thing is that we're still seeing a lot of overlapping, imperfect legal frameworks. There's a lot of strategies that people have shared on how to do that. Specifically, things that today came out was the importance of land rights for climate change, for water flows, for biodiversity, the role of guardians. All this new data that's coming out of these projects is really substantiating that. And I think it was really exciting today to see all of these figures coming from many other countries and from David's presentation. The question is, how do we get this conservation community and the climate change communities to advocate much more strongly? How do we get them to become advocates? It won't guarantee that governments will respond, but certainly the maps are powerful, the data is powerful, we have more evidence. The other thing is that I think the pandemic, we're hearing that the pandemic has educated the public in a number of countries on the resilience and the role that communities play, indigenous communities play in resilience. We also see that the timelines of all the projects have had to shift because the pandemic has required new methods of work, new protocols, but also delayed things, and government has not been meeting and hasn't been able to respond. And then the other thing we see is that these councils, these supra community structures for regional governance at the provincial or district level provide a structure that now governments can respond to. So that has really been an innovation and a strength of the project so far. So I guess the thing is, keep the learning going. This is just fantastic.